Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. This week we've got something a little bit different for you. I've been looking at a lot of commander cards that I've been playing lately, and I've noticed that not a lot of other people are playing them, so I wanted to break down a bit of a top 10 for you. And this is going to be top 10 budget commander cards that you're not playing. So our criteria for this, before we jump into it, I define budget as anything less than $1. I believe most of the cards on this list are actually under 50 cents. And I want to specify that when I say you are not playing them, I say that because I'm looking at the EDHRec statistics for the cards, and all of them are in 1% or less of the decks that could be playing these cards. So I want to run through my top 10 cards that I think you should be playing more of. I'll give you my reasons why I think you should be playing them, and then we'll kind of break things down. So let's start with number 10 on our list, which is a personal favorite of mine. That is going to be Tenuous Truce. So Tenuous Truce, 1 and a white for an enchantment aura, enchant opponent. At the beginning of enchanted opponent's end step, you and that player each draw a card. When you attack enchanted opponent or a planeswalker they control, or when they attack you or a planeswalker you control, sacrifice Tenuous Truce. Now, Tenuous Truce, according to TCG Player, 25 cents. It's in 1% of all decks that can play it. This is an absolutely amazing card, and I genuinely believe that it's underrated by almost everyone because you can put it on any opponent. That is most likely going to prevent that opponent from attacking you. You've just made a friend at the table, plus you're both drawing additional cards. They don't want to attack you to get rid of the aura. They want to keep drawing cards most of the time. So this really does double duty in the sense that it prevents one player from the table from hitting you, and it's giving you card advantage, which may not seem like a lot considering one of your opponents is also getting that same card advantage, but it is something that's going to add up as the game goes on. Moving on to card number 9, we're going to talk a little bit about Key to the City. So Key to the City is a card that my friend Mike, McKG3 on Twitch, go check him out, actually really supports, and he's the one that kind of got me into this card and got me playing this card. Key to the City is 2 mana for an artifact. You can tap it to discard a card. Up to 1 target creature can't be blocked this turn. Whenever it becomes untapped, you may pay 2. If you do, draw a card. So again, 39 cents, 1% of decks. This is perfect for any deck that either struggles to draw cards, cares about being unblockable, cares about discarding. It really just does so much that you want it to do because you get to choose what you discard. You can throw away reanimation targets. You can throw away cards with flashback. It then also makes things unblockable. So if you have a huge creature that you need to get through, maybe you want to try to knock someone out with commander damage. Maybe you just have to get through some damage. Maybe something has a damage dealing trigger, things like that. And then of course you can pay mana to draw cards with it when you untap it, which is not the best ideal situation because you don't want to be paying the 2, but it's still something, and it's certainly better than nothing. Moving on to number 8 on our list, we're going to talk about Deadly Cover-Up. And this one is going to look a little bit weird, but bear with me as we start talking about this. Deadly Cover-Up is 3 black for a sorcery. As an additional cost to cast this spell, you may collect Evidence 6, destroy all creatures. If evidence was collected, exile a card from an opponent's graveyard, then search its owner's graveyard, hand, and library for any number of cards with that name. Exile them, that player shuffles, then draws a card for each card exiled from their hand this way. So normally, when we're talking about playing a spell in black and we're talking about board wipes, typically the cards that come up would be things like Damnation, which is cheaper, it's 4 mana, but it's incredibly expensive. Deadly Cover-Up is only 50 cents and it's played in 0% of decks. Now, that obviously is not a very high number, but I genuinely thought it would be at least a little bit higher because Deadly Cover-Up is just a 5 mana board wipe in mono black. That on its own is incredibly powerful, but if you read the specific wording of the card very carefully, you'll notice that if you collect evidence, you search for an opponent's graveyard, hand, library for a card with the same name as a card you exile from their graveyard. Since we're playing Commander, that's normally not going to be relevant, but if you read a little bit closer, it specifically says you exile a card from an opponent's graveyard. It does not say a non-land card. So if for some reason you're able to pair this up with a little bit of targeted land destruction, or maybe someone just discards one of their basic lands, you could actually pull every basic land out of their deck. And obviously that's going to be a little bit tricky. It's got a lot of setup to it, but I really do think this is a card that should see more play, and I think it deserves a bit of respect, I think, for some of the things that it can do. Anyway, moving on to number 7 on our list, we're going to talk about Vastwood Surge. Now, this, again, might look a little bit weird, so let me explain it to you. Vastwood Surge is 3 and a green for a sorcery. It has Kicker for 4. Search your library for up to 2 basic land cards, put them onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. If this spell was kicked, put 2 +1/+1 counters on each creature you control. And it is 25 cents and in 1% of decks. So there are a lot of decks that want ramp, and I know that for green ramp, a lot of people have started looking at 2 mana ramp rather than 3 or 4, but I do still genuinely believe that 4 mana ramp is perfectly fine in a game of Commander, and a lot of people would play things like Explosive Vegetation or Migration Path, but I think Vastwood Surge is actually better than all of those. I mean, it's strictly better than Explosive Vegetation because it has the kicker ability, but being able to play it for 4 mana to get 2 lands, or play it for 8 mana to get 2 lands and put 2 +1/+1 counters on all your creatures, essentially allows this card to act as both ramp in the early game and a finisher in the late game, which is not a thing that a lot of cards can do. And there have been a lot of games that I've won because I've been able to go wide and then put 2 +1/+1 counters on my creatures with Vastwood Surge. And that's something that's incredibly easy to do in a landfall deck where you're making tokens and you're dealing with a bunch of lands entering the battlefield and ramping. So just try Vastwood Surge. I promise you it's better than it looks. Moving on to card number 6 on our list, we have Reenact the Crime. This is a card that when I started making this list, I was like, oh man, I really want to put Reenact the Crime on this list, but there's no way it is 1% or less on EDHRec. And somehow I went to look it up and it's 1% and it's 46 cents, which is absolutely absurd. If you are in a blue deck, you should be playing Reenact the Crime. Let's read through this card because I got a little too excited about it, but it is 1 blue for an instant. Exile target non-land card in a graveyard that was put there from anywhere this turn. Copy it. You may cast the copy without paying its mana cost. This immediately doesn't sound like too much. Like, yeah, if someone mills a card, you can get it, or if someone discards a card, you can get it, and that's great and all. But you can also just get cards that have been cast because it specifies that a non-land card goes to a graveyard from anywhere. So if someone casts a giant spell, you can just say for 4 mana, hey, that was cool. What if I did it too? This also means that you can exile things like people's reanimation targets. If someone discards an Atraxa, you can exile the Atraxa from their graveyard and then copy it, and you now have the Atraxa, plus their original is exiled, so they cannot get it back. I genuinely believe that this might be one of the best blue spells that they've printed in the last few years for Commander, and it puts in so much work as the game goes on, and I do know that it is difficult to cast with the triple blue pips, but if you're in mono blue 2-color, or honestly even 3-color decks that run blue, I still think that this is worth it. I think it can just do absolutely game-breaking things if you're in the right situation. Moving on to number 5 on our list, we've hit our halfway point. We're going to talk about Tectonic Reformation. Tectonic Reformation, 1 in a red for an enchantment. Each land card in your hand has cycling for a red, and then Tectonic Reformation itself has cycling for 2. So this is 35 cents and 1% of decks. This is a card that I kind of used a lot when it first came out, and then it fell off for me and I stopped using it for a while, and now I'm back on the Tectonic Reformation train because this card is a house in red decks. Specifically, if you are a red deck or any version that involves red, so Boros is a big one, Rakdos, Gruul even, being able to cycle away your lands in the hopes that you can find some action is incredibly powerful if you are the aggressive deck at the table. You desperately do not want to be flooding out when you want to be hitting people, and if you can start throwing away extra lands, that just means you are drawing more and more cards, and cycling for only 1 red is still very, very powerful and very, very cheap. This also works well in conjunction with things that want you to discard cards, or with things that want you to put lands into your graveyard. If you have a Jund deck that has like the Gitrog monster, for example, being able to just pitch a land to trigger it whenever you want, very powerful card. It really puts in a lot of work, and you should be playing it a lot more. Moving on to number 4. For this one, we have Mirror Shield, and I know this one is probably going to be the most controversial one on this list, because a lot of times when I bring up Mirror Shield, people always tell me that this card is awful. There's so many better options out there. And while I do agree that there are better options, it's still only 37 cents, and it's being seen in less than 0% of decks. Well, I don't know if you can get less than 0%, but you know what I'm saying. Mirror Shield is 2 mana for an artifact equipment. Equipped creature gets +0/+2, has hexproof, and whenever a creature with Death Touch blocks or becomes blocked by this creature, destroy that creature, and it equips for 2. So this essentially is another form of Swiftfoot Boots or Lightning Greaves. I know there's also Mask of Avacyn. There's a bunch of cards that give hexproof, but a lot of them tend to be on the more expensive side. And while this is 2 to equip, 2 to play, so it's 4 mana total, it also provides a couple of extra things that a lot of those other cards don't. Being able to get +0/+2 is surprisingly effective when you're trying to keep a commander alive, and it also shuts down Death Touch, because if you can attack with your commander, but you know that an opponent just has a 1/1 with Death Touch, and now all of a sudden you're stuck, you can't get through, there's nothing you can do about it. Mirror Shield doesn't care. It doesn't matter what they throw in front of you. Presumably it's not going to be just a 1/1 with Death Touch, but it's a great way of protecting your commander, both from combat, from removal, and from damage-based board wipes. So I do think Mirror Shield should get a lot more hype than it actually does, but I do understand that that is one of the more controversial picks on this list. Moving on to number 3. So now that we've made it to our top 3, we have Stone Speaker Crystal. So Stone Speaker Crystal is 4 mana for an artifact. It taps for 2 colorless, and you can pay 2, tap it, and sacrifice it to exile any number of target players' graveyards and draw a card. So this is very similar to Hedron Archive in the sense that it can sacrifice itself to draw 2, you can pay it for 4, it taps for 2 mana. But I do genuinely believe this is better than Hedron Archive, because it is 2 to tap it to exile any number of graveyards, and you still get to draw a card from it. This is graveyard hate that comes attached to a mana rock, plus it replaces itself. I genuinely don't know what else you could want from a card, especially because it's colorless. You can put it in decks that typically don't have a ton of graveyard removal. Putting it in a mono blue deck or a mono red deck that can't exile an opponent's graveyard means that you can now ramp into some of your bigger stuff, and then when you don't need it anymore, or in case of an emergency, sacrifice it in exile graveyards, and then replace itself, of course. So put Stone Speaker Crystal in more of your decks. It's colorless. It should be in way more than 1% of decks. Moving on to number 2 in our top 10, we have Starlight Spectacular. And this card was another one very similar to Reenact the Crime that I was like, oh man, I want to put Starlight Spectacular on this list, but it's definitely got to be more than 1%, or it's got to be above $1 because it's just so good. And yet somehow it is 50 cents and in 0% of decks. People, why are you not playing this card? It is 2 white for an enchantment. It has Parade. At the beginning of combat on your turn, choose creatures you control one at a time until each creature you control has been chosen. Each of those creatures gets +1/+1 until end of turn for each creature chosen before it. So this is a very convoluted way of wording this card, which honestly might be a factor in why people don't play it. But even if you have just 3 creatures, you are choosing one creature, it gets +0/+0 because it's first in line. The second creature is getting +1/+1, and the third one is getting +2/+2, and that's just every time you go to combat. So if you start ramping up and adding more creatures to the board, this gets out of hand very quickly. If you are in a deck that makes a ton of tokens, or even just has a moderate board state, because honestly you only need 4 or 5 creatures for this to get really crazy, because even just 5 creatures is giving +4/+4 to the last creature, +3 to the one before that, +2, +1. It really does make all of combat a lot trickier for the blockers, and it just pumps the board up like crazy. Because at its worst, it's giving something +0/+0, but even at its best, it's just giving +1/+1 to everything. And that is essentially just an Anthem in its own, plus it's giving so much more to any extra creatures. This is also a great way you can put the massive buffs on creatures that might be unblockable, that might have trample, that might have some form of evasion. Starlight Spectacular really is just that good. And before I talk too much about it, we're going to move on to number 1 on our list. And this is a card that when I was building this list, and I was like, boy, it's really tough to put a card at number 1. I don't know what I want it to be. I remembered that this card existed, and immediately it went to number 1. Like, I didn't even hesitate before putting it there. That is Coveted Jewel. This is genuinely one of my favorite cards in all of Magic, and a lot of people are not playing it. It's 25 cents, it's in 1% of decks, and it is 6 mana for an artifact. When it enters the battlefield, draw 3 cards, tap, add 3 mana of any one color, and whenever one or more creatures an opponent controls attack you and aren't blocked, that player draws 3 cards and gains control of Coveted Jewel. Untap it. So I think a lot of people don't play this because it does look a little bit concerning. You're going to let your opponents draw 3 cards and also get access to 3 mana. That's really not what you want to be doing. However, people overlook the fact that you are the first person who gets to activate this Coveted Jewel. You are the first person to draw 3 cards. You are the first person to make the mana. And if someone steals it from you, that just means you have the chance to steal it back and draw 3 more cards. This card genuinely makes combat enjoyable for a lot of tables. It gives you something to go after, and I'm personally a big fan of cards that promote combat because I think a lot of players just tend to sit there, not attack, do their own thing, and I would much rather be swinging every turn if given the chance. So anything that promotes combat is where I want to be. I think this is an awesome card. And it's colorless. Every single deck can and should be playing this. The fact that it's 1% of decks is honestly a crime. We gotta fix it. This thing has to be more than 1%. So anyway, that brings us to the end of our top 10 list. Let me know what you think of our 10 cards. Let me know if there's any cards that are budget commander cards that you would love to see on lists like this. Maybe cards that you think are amazing and other people just don't play. Or did I get something wrong? Are some of these cards legitimately bad and that's why people don't play them? Let me know down in the comments. I would love to hear what you all think. And if this is something that you would like to see again in the future, I'm sure there's plenty of cards I can put together a top 10 list for, so let me know what you'd like to see. But otherwise, please do like the video, subscribe to the channel, and thank you all so much for watching. I'll see you on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.